They dismissed it in a single sentence. Efficient, public, and carefully timed to sound final. An MBA. Years of discipline, proven outcomes, reduced to a line that didn't even try to evaluate, only to neutralize. The room responded exactly as expected. Quiet nods, controlled expressions, the subtle choreography of agreement without conviction. But decisions made too quickly often leave a trail. Not visible at first, not loud, just precise. She didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't correct them. Because in certain rooms, the fastest reaction isn't strength, it's exposure. And what no one noticed in that moment was that her silence wasn't compliance. It was timing. The conference room carried that polished stillness typical of executive floors. Glass walls, calibrated lighting, a table too immaculate to tolerate uncertainty. Even the air felt managed. On the screen, her profile, education, projects, metrics, each line precise, measurable, verified. And yet, an MBA doesn't matter here, HR said, almost casually, as if neutralizing value was part of the process. A few people shifted in their seats. Not disagreement, recalibration, the kind that happens when authority speaks before analysis. She sat still, not frozen, not surprised, observing. Because tone, in rooms like this, always reveals more than content. The phrasing wasn't evaluative, it was strategic. Not, we don't need this role. Not, the position changed. But it doesn't matter. A subtle but critical distinction, one that removes not the role, but the value itself. And when value is dismissed publicly, it's rarely about performance. It's about positioning. She closed her folder, slowly, deliberately. No rush, no signal of urgency. Someone across the table glanced at the VP, a quick, almost invisible check for confirmation. He didn't intervene. That, too, was information. Because in structured environments, silence from leadership is never neutral. It's alignment. The decision had already been made. This meeting was simply the moment it became visible. But visibility works both ways. Every word spoken in that room didn't just define her position, it defined theirs. She reached for her pen. Not to argue, not to annotate, just to sign. A clean motion, controlled, final, no escalation, no resistance. And that's what made it uncomfortable. Because people expect friction when something valuable is removed. Pushback, emotion, negotiation. Instead, they got precision. She stood up, adjusted her jacket, a brief professional nod. Not to HR, not to the VP, but to the room itself. Acknowledgement, not agreement. And then she walked out. The door closed softly. No emphasis, no statement. Just absence. For a moment, nothing moved. The kind of pause that isn't silence, but recalculation. HR exhaled first. A quiet release of tension masked as routine. Well, she said, glancing at her notes, that was straightforward. Straightforward. An interesting word for a decision that removed measurable value without measurable cause. The VP leaned back slightly, fingers tapping once against the table. A micro gesture, easily missed. He was already moving on. Because in his model, this wasn't a loss. It was a replacement. And replacements, by definition, don't carry risk. At least, that's how it's framed. But frameworks have limits, especially when they ignore dependencies. On the screen, her profile was still open, untouched, unclosed. A small oversight. Or maybe a placeholder. Because sometimes what remains visible after a decision isn't there by accident. And somewhere between the closing of that door and the next item on the agenda, something subtle shifted. Not in the room, in the structure behind it. The kind of shift that doesn't interrupt immediately, but accumulates. Quietly, precisely. And by the time it's noticed, it's no longer a discussion. It's a consequence. The meeting dissolved faster than it should have. Not abruptly. That would suggest disruption. This was cleaner, controlled. Agenda resumed, slides advanced, voices normalized. The machine continued, but something had been removed. Not visibly, not structurally, operationally. Her access didn't terminate immediately. HR protocols rarely move that fast. Systems lag behind decisions, always have. And in that gap, things remain active. Her credentials still authenticated, her dashboard still loaded, her work streams still assigned. Because while authority had spoken, infrastructure hadn't caught up. She walked through the corridor without slowing down. No phone in hand, no visible reaction, just direction. There's a difference between leaving a room and exiting a system. Most people confuse the two. She didn't. At her desk, nothing looked different. Same screen, same data, same quiet rhythm of processes running exactly as configured. Which was the point? Because her role wasn't symbolic, it was embedded. Deep enough that removing the person didn't immediately remove the function. And that's where the miscalculation lived. She logged in. Not urgently, not defensively, methodically. The hiring pipeline dashboard opened first. Live data, real numbers, current exposure. A single metric stood out. $18 million. Projected hiring allocation tied to a pending contract cycle. Her structure, her thresholds, her approvals. Designed to prevent exactly one thing: unverified replacement decisions. She didn't build it for control, she built it for accountability. And accountability, when ignored, doesn't disappear. It activates. She navigated to the contract layer. Permissions, dependencies, trigger conditions, everything still intact, because no one had revoked her authority inside the system, only outside of it. That distinction was about to matter. In the conference room, they had already moved on to the next candidate. Profiles compared, timelines compressed, assumptions accelerating. "We'll fill it quickly," someone said. Confidence without validation. A familiar pattern. The VP glanced briefly at the screen. "Make it efficient," he replied. Efficiency. Another interesting word when used before verification. Back at her desk, she opened the final document. Not new. Existing. Structured weeks ago, long before this meeting. Clause references aligned with financial triggers. Loss exposure tied directly to approval authority. A safeguard. Not against people. Against decisions made without full visibility. She read it once. Not to review. To confirm. Everything was still exactly where it needed to be. No edits, no additions. Because systems like this don't rely on last-minute changes. They rely on what was already signed. She clicked. One action. Not dramatic, not visible, but definitive. The kind that doesn't interrupt immediately, but registers. And then she logged out. Cleanly. No hesitation, no trace of urgency. Because when structure is correct, execution is simple. In the conference room, nothing changed. At least not yet. The discussion continued. Timelines shortened. Confidence increased, until a notification appeared. Small. System generated. Easy to ignore. Except it wasn't ignored. The VP paused. Just for a second. Then opened it. His expression didn't change immediately, but his posture did. A subtle shift. Forward, focused. Because what he was reading wasn't a message. It was a condition, linked to the very decision made less than an hour ago. $18 million hiring allocation, now flagged. Pending authorization, now restricted. Replacement action, now classified as unverified. And beneath it, one line. Clear. Unambiguous. Approval authority mismatch detected. The room went quiet. Not the earlier kind, not rehearsed. This was different. This was realization. Because in that moment, the decision they thought was complete was still inside a system that hadn't agreed with them. And systems don't argue. They enforce. The VP looked at HR, then back at the screen, then again at the line that shouldn't have been there, but was. And for the first time since she left, there was no immediate next step, only a pause, measured, heavy, and growing. Because what they were starting to understand wasn't that something had gone wrong, it was that something had already been defined, long before they made their decision. And now, they were inside it. If this is the moment where everything shifted for you, you're seeing exactly how decisions really work behind the surface. Not in the words that are spoken, but in the structures that remain after they're said. Subscribe if you want more stories where silence carries consequences. Like the video if you've ever seen authority move too fast and miss what was already in place. And comment. In your experience, was it ever really about performance? Because what happens next is where control changes hands. The silence didn't break. It stretched, not dramatic, not loud, just long enough to force attention into places no one wanted to look. The screen remained unchanged, that single line still visible. Approval authority mismatch detected. The VP didn't speak immediately. He read it again, slower this time, as if pace alone could alter meaning. It didn't. Check the permissions, he said finally, voice controlled, almost neutral. Not a reaction, a directive. But directives assume control. And control, in that moment, was already under review. IT joined the call within seconds. Screen mirrored, layers opened, user roles, access logs, authorization chains, everything precise, everything timestamped, everything aligned. That's not possible, HR said too quickly. A familiar phrase, often used not when something is incorrect, but when something is unexpected. The IT lead didn't respond. He was already tracing the dependency chain, and that's where it became uncomfortable, because the system wasn't blocking randomly. It was following structure. The hiring allocation, $18 million, wasn't just a number. It was bound to a control layer. A governance mechanism designed to prevent unauthorized replacement decisions, and that control layer was still assigned to her, not by accident, by design. Why wasn't this reassigned? The VP asked, sharper now. No one answered immediately, because reassignment requires awareness, and awareness requires time, neither of which had been applied. She just left, HR said, quieter this time. We didn't process it yet. Process. Another word that sounds safe, until it lags behind consequence. The IT lead zoomed in. Contract layer, authorization matrix, clause reference attached. He paused. Section 11, he said. The VP leaned forward. What about it? The IT lead didn't look up from the screen. It links hiring allocation to original approval authority. Any replacement action without transfer of that authority flags as unverified and restricts execution. A pause. Short, but dense. The VP understood immediately, because this wasn't a bug. It was a safeguard, and safeguards don't negotiate. Override it, he said, direct, efficient, the way decisions are supposed to work. Except, can't, IT replied. No hesitation, no explanation needed, but one came anyway. It requires dual authorization, current holder, and executive confirmation tied to the original contract. The room recalibrated again, faster this time, because now the structure was visible, and visibility changes behavior. Call her, HR said, the first reactive statement since this started. The VP didn't respond. He was still looking at the clause, not reading, calculating, because what mattered wasn't just access, it was exposure. An $18 million hiring allocation now effectively paused, a contract cycle depending on it, timelines already committed, stakeholders expecting execution, and all of it hinged on a decision made less than an hour ago. She resigned, someone added quietly. As if that simplified things. It didn't. If anything, it removed the easiest path. Because resignation doesn't erase authority inside a system, only process does. And process was behind. The IT lead shifted slightly. There's more. Not louder, but enough. He expanded the clause. Additional condition, Secondary trigger, linked to financial loss. In case of unauthorized replacement leading to hiring disruption, he read, liability exposure is assigned to initiating authority. No one moved. Because now this wasn't operational, it was personal. The VP leaned back slowly. For the first time, his posture wasn't control. It was distance, not from the screen, from the implication. Define initiating authority, he said. The IT lead didn't answer immediately. He highlighted a field, name, role, timestamp, all aligned, all recent, all his. No one spoke, because in that moment, the structure did something subtle. It reassigned weight, not loudly, not aggressively, just accurately. And that's what made it difficult, because nothing here was unclear. No ambiguity, no interpretation gap, just a sequence. Decision to action to condition to exposure. Clean, precise, irreversible, without cooperation. HR looked at the VP, waiting. Not for instruction, for direction. A difference that becomes visible only when authority is no longer absolute. He didn't answer, not immediately, because now the fastest move wasn't forward. It was careful, and careful takes time. Time they had already compressed. Outside the room, nothing had changed. Same corridor, same silence, same rhythm of a building that had no awareness of what had just shifted inside it. But inside, everything had, because what they thought was a closed decision was still open inside a system that required agreement, and agreement was no longer theirs alone. At the far end of the table, someone finally said it, quietly. We need her back. No emphasis, no strategy, just recognition. Because in certain structures, removal doesn't eliminate dependency, it exposes it, and now they could see it. Clearly, and too late to pretend otherwise. The decision to call her didn't happen instantly. It formed, slowly, reluctantly, as if the room itself resisted admitting what had already become obvious. Because reaching out now wasn't a continuation of control. It was an acknowledgement of it being lost. The VP remained still for a moment longer, eyes fixed on the screen. Not reading anymore, just holding the structure in place mentally. Then, get her on the line. No edge, no volume, just precision. HR hesitated, barely noticeable, but enough. Because earlier she had been the one setting tone. Now she was executing. Different position, different weight. The call went out. 1 ring, 2. No answer. Of course, because urgency doesn't transfer automatically, not after dismissal. Try again, the VP said. Still controlled. But now there was something else beneath it. Compression. Time, which had been managed earlier, was now starting to define them. The second call connected. No greeting on her side. Just silence. But not the passive kind. The kind that waits. The VP spoke first. We need to resolve an authorization issue. No apology, no context. Just framing. Efficient. Predictable. A mistake. Because framing only works when both sides still share structure. They didn't. On the other end, she didn't respond immediately. A short pause. Measured. Then, I'm no longer part of the company. Calm, neutral, final, not emotional. And that's what made it difficult to redirect. This concerns the hiring allocation, he continued, adjusting slightly. There's a restriction. I'm aware, she said. No interruption, no escalation, just information. Which meant one thing. She wasn't discovering the situation. She had anticipated it. The VP's tone shifted, slightly, not softer, more deliberate. We need your authorization to proceed. There it was. Clear, direct, and fundamentally different from the conversation an hour ago. Another pause. Longer this time, not hesitation. Assessment. Because now she wasn't responding to authority. She was evaluating position. Under what terms? She asked. No emotion, no edge, just structure. And that's when the room understood. This wasn't recovery. It was negotiation. The VP leaned forward, elbows lightly on the table. "What do you want?" A question often asked too late, and almost always answered precisely. On the other end, she didn't rush, because when timing shifts in your favor, speed becomes unnecessary. "A formal correction of today's decision," she said. Clear. A reinstatement of role and authority tied to the original contract. HR closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, because that wasn't just reversal, it was acknowledgement, public or private. That detail hadn't been specified. Yet. The VP didn't respond immediately, calculating again, because now there were two exposures. Operational, $18 million frozen. Reputational, internal reversal. Both measurable, both visible. And the second condition? He asked. He already knew there would be one. There always is. A short silence. Then, "A written clarification," she said, "that the evaluation conducted today did not reflect performance metrics or contractual obligations." Careful wording, not aggressive, but exact, because language defines record, and record defines future. The VP leaned back. Slowly. For the second time in less than an hour, the room had shifted beneath him. Only now, the shift wasn't hidden. It was explicit. "This delays execution," he said. Not a rejection, a signal. She didn't respond to the delay, because delay, in this context, wasn't her variable. It was his. Another pause. Then, "We're already delayed." Not louder, not sharper, but final. Because the system had already made that clear. The VP looked at the screen again. That same line, still there, still active, still defining the situation more accurately than any statement in the room. He exhaled. Once. Controlled. Then nodded. Not to her. To the structure. "Prepare the documents," he said. HR didn't move immediately, just looked at him, confirming, because this wasn't a standard process anymore. It was a reversal. "Yes," he added. That was enough. The call remained open. No one rushed to close it, because something subtle had changed again. Not control, not authority, alignment. But this time, it wasn't assumed, it was negotiated. And as the first drafts of correction began to form, the system remained exactly as it was. Locked. Waiting. Unmoved. Because systems like this don't respond to intention, only to action. And until that action was completed, fully, correctly, and with both sides aligned, nothing would proceed. Not the hiring, not the contract, not the decision they thought had already been made. The VP glanced once more at the timestamp. 49 minutes, that's all it took. To move from dismissal to dependency. And what made it irreversible wasn't the system. It was the sequence that led to it. Clean. Documented. And now, corrected. The documents moved faster than usual, not because the process had improved, but because hesitation had been removed. Legal reviewed the language twice, not for compliance, but for precision. Every word now carried weight beyond internal optics. Correction of decision, reinstatement of authority, clarification of evaluation context, phrases chosen carefully, because once written, they wouldn't just resolve the moment, they would define the record. HR adjusted formatting, dates aligned, timestamps verified, no ambiguity allowed. The VP didn't interfere. For the first time since the meeting began, he wasn't directing the process. He was following it. A subtle but critical inversion. The final draft appeared on the screen. Clean, structured, irreversible once signed. "Send it," he said. No emphasis, no delay. The document left the room. Digital, immediate, trackable. And then, waiting, not long. Just enough to feel it. Because now the system wasn't blocking them. It was observing completion. A notification appeared. Not the earlier one. A new one. Different tone. Different status. Authorization conditions satisfied. The restriction lifted. Instantly. No transition. No animation. One state to another. Clean. Precise. The hiring allocation unlocked. The contract cycle resumed. Access pathways restored. Operational flow returned as if nothing had happened. But that's the illusion. Because something had. HR exhaled quietly. Relief, masked as routine. IT closed the session. The dashboard cleared. The VP remained still, eyes on the screen a second longer than necessary. Because restoration doesn't erase sequence, it confirms it. He stood up, adjusted his jacket. The same motion she had made earlier. Only now. It carried different context. Proceed, he said. And just like that, the room returned to function. Voices normalized, tasks resumed, timelines recalculated. The machine continued, but not unchanged, because structures remember, not emotionally, systemically. From this point forward, every decision in that room would carry an invisible reference. What happens when control is assumed, without alignment? Across the building, nothing looked different. Corridors remained quiet, screens remained active, conversations remained routine. And at her desk, her system access was fully restored. Not as an exception, as a condition fulfilled. She logged in. No urgency, no visible reaction, just continuity. Because for her, nothing had shifted. The structure had simply corrected itself. She opened the same dashboard. $18 million allocation. Active, unrestricted, aligned. Exactly as designed. No extra steps. No manual overrides. Because when systems are built correctly, they don't escalate, they resolve. A message appeared. Internal, short, from the VP. Confirmed. No apology, no explanation, just acknowledgement. She read it once, then archived it, not out of dismissal, out of completion. Because in environments like this, closure isn't emotional, it's structural. She stood up briefly, adjusted her workspace, the same precision as before, because nothing about her position had changed, only the room's understanding of it. And somewhere between that first sentence, it doesn't matter, and this final confirmation, the cost of assumption had been fully calculated. Not in tone, not in opinion, in outcome, clean, documented, and impossible to ignore. Silence returned. But this time, it wasn't control, it was awareness.